Chapter 1 Nightmare. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with her 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we'd better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the quote-unquote back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with the butt of their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the Nightmare Night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into the frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the 2 white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white policemen and firemen came and stood around, watching as the house burned to the ground. My mother was crying. She started to skin the rabbit, preparatory to cooking it. But my father was so angry, he slammed on out the front door and started walking up the road towards town. It was then that my mother had this vision. She had always been a strange woman in this sense, and had always had a strong intuition of things about to happen. And most of her children are the same way, I think. When something is about to happen, I can feel something, sense something. I never have known something to happen that has caught me completely off guard except once. And that was when, years later, I discovered facts I couldn't believe about a man who, up until that discovery, I would gladly have given my life for. My father was well up the road when my mother ran screaming out onto the porch. "Early, early!" She screamed his name. She clutched up her apron in one hand and ran down across the yard and into the road. My father turned around. He saw her. For some reason, considering how angry he had been when he left, he waved at her, but he kept on going. She told me later, my mother did, that she had a vision of my father's end. All the rest of the afternoon, she was not herself, crying and nervous and upset. She finished cooking the rabbit and put the whole thing in the warmer part of the black stove. When my father was not back home by our bedtime, my mother hugged and clutched us, and we felt strange, not knowing what to do because she had never acted like that. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother screaming again. When I scrambled out, I saw the police in the living room. They were trying to calm her down. She had snatched on her clothes to go with them, and all of us children who were staring knew, without anyone having to say it, that something terrible had happened to our father. My mother was taken by the police to the hospital and to a room where a sheet was over my father in a bed, and she wouldn't look. She was afraid to look. Probably it was wise that she didn't. My father's skull on one side was crushed in, I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run over him. His body was cut almost in half. Pride was just about all we had to preserve, for by 1934 we really began to suffer. This was about the worst Depression year, and no one we knew had enough to eat or live on. Some old family friends visited us now and then, At first, they brought food. Though it was charity, my mother took it. Then, about in late 1934, I would guess, something began to happen. Some kind of psychological deterioration hit our family circle and began to eat away our pride. Perhaps it was the constant, tangible evidence that we were destitute. We had known other families who had gone on relief. We had known, without anyone in our home ever expressing it, that we had felt prouder not to be at the depot where the free food was passed out. And now we were among them. At school, the on relief finger suddenly was pointed at us too, and sometimes it was said aloud. It seemed that everything to eat in our house was stamped not to be sold. All welfare food bore the stamp to keep the recipients from selling it. It's a wonder we didn't come to think of not to be sold as a brand name. Sometimes instead of going home from school, I walked the 2 miles up the road into Lansing. I began drifting from store to store, hanging around outside where things like apples were displayed in boxes and barrels and baskets, and I would watch my chance and steal me a treat. You know what a treat was to me? Anything. Or I began to drop in around dinner time at the home of some family that we knew. I knew that they knew exactly why I was there, but they never embarrassed me by letting on. They would invite me to stay for supper, and I would stuff myself. Talked as he drove along, saying that my school marks showed that if I would just straighten up, I could make something of myself. He said that reform school had the wrong reputation. He talked about what the word reform meant, to change and become better. He said that the school was really a place where boys like me would have time to see their mistakes and start a new life and become somebody everyone would be proud of. And he told me that the lady in charge of the detention home, a Mrs. Swerlin, and her husband were very good people. They were good people. Mrs. Swerlin was bigger than her husband, I remember. A big, buxom, robust, laughing woman. And Mr. Swerlin was thin, with black hair, a black mustache, and a red face. Quiet and polite, even to me. They liked me right away, too. Mrs. Swerlin showed me to my room, the first in my life. It was in one of those huge dormitory-like buildings where kids in detention were kept in those days, and still are in most places. I discovered next, with surprise, that I was allowed to eat with the Swerlins. It was the first time I'd eaten with white people, at least with grown white people, since the Seventh-day Adventist country meetings. It wasn't my own exclusive privilege, of course, except for the very troublesome boys and girls at the detention home who were kept locked up. Those who had run away and been caught and brought back, or something like that. All of us ate with the Swerlins, sitting at the head of the long tables. I noticed again how white people smelled different from us, and how their food tasted different, not seasoned like Negro cooking. I began to sweep and mop and dust around in the Swerlins' house, as I had done with Big Boy at the Gohannes's. They all liked my attitude, and it was out of their liking for me that I soon became accepted by them. As a mascot, I now know. They would talk about anything and everything with me standing right there hearing them. The same way people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. They would even talk about me or about niggers as though I wasn't there, as if I wouldn't understand what the word meant. 100 times a day they used the word nigger. I suppose that in their own minds they meant no harm. In fact, they probably meant well. It was the same with the cook, Lucille, and her husband, Dwayne. I remembered one day when Miss Swerlin, as nice as she was, came in from Lansing, where he had been through the Negro section, and said to Miss Swerlin right in front of me, "I just can't see how those niggers can be so happy and be so poor." He talked about how they lived in shacks, but had those big shining cars out front. And Mrs. Swerlin said, me standing right there, "Niggers are just that way." The scene always stayed with me. Going on, Okay. What I'm trying to say is that it just never dawned upon them that I could understand, that I wasn't a pet, but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensitivity, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it has historically been the case with white people in their regard for black people that even though we might be with them, we weren't considered of them. Even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they never did really see me. English and history were the subjects that I liked most. My English teacher, I recall, a Mr. Ostrowski, was always giving advice about how to become something in life. The one thing I didn't like about history class was that the teacher, Mr. Williams, was a great one for nigger jokes. One day during my first week at school, I walked into the room and he started singing to the class as a joke. Way down yonder in the cotton field, some folks say that a nigger won't steal. Very funny. I liked history, but I never thereafter had much liking for Mr. Williams. Later, I remember we came to the textbook section on Negro history. It was exactly one paragraph long. Mr. Williams laughed through it practically in a single breath, reading aloud how the Negroes had been slaves and then were freed, and how they were usually lazy and dumb and shiftless. He added, I remember, an anthropological footnote on his own, telling us between laughs how Negroes' feet were so big that when they walk, they don't leave tracks. They leave a hole in the ground. It was on that way, and I became increasingly restless and disturbed through the first semester. And then one day, just about when those of us who had passed were about to move up to 8A, from which we would enter high school the next year, something happened which was to become the first major turning point of my life. Somehow, I happened to be alone in the classroom with Mr. Ostrowski, my English teacher. He was a tall, rather reddish white man, and he had a thick mustache. I had gotten some of my best marks under him, and he had always made me feel that he liked me. He was, as I have mentioned, a natural-born advisor about what you ought to read, to do, or think about any and everything. We used to make unkind jokes about him. Why was he teaching in Mason instead of somewhere else, getting for himself some of the success in life that he kept telling us how to get? I know he probably meant well in what he happened to advise me that day. I doubt that he meant any harm. It was just in his nature as an American white man. I was one of his top students, one of the school's top students. But all he could see for me was the kind of future in your place that almost all white people see for black people. He told me, Malcolm, you ought to be thinking about a career. Have you been giving it thought? The truth is, I hadn't. I'd never figured out why. I told him, well, yes, sir, I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer. Lansing certainly had no Negro lawyers or doctors either in those days to hold up as an image I might have aspired to. All I really knew for certain was that a lawyer didn't wash dishes as I was doing. Mr. Ostrowski looked surprised, I remember, and leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. He kind of half smiled and said, Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me now. We all here like you. You know that. But you've got to be realistic about being a nigger. A lawyer, that's no realistic goal for a nigger. You have to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands, making things. Everybody admires your carpentry shop work. Why don't you plan on carpentry? People like you as a person. You get all kinds of work. The more I thought afterwards about what he said, the more uneasy it made me. It just kept treading around in my mind. What made it really begin to disturb me was Mr. Ostrowski's advice to others in my class, all of them white. Most of them had told him they were planning to become farmers. But those who wanted to strike out on their own to try something new, he had encouraged. Some, mostly girls, wanted to be teachers. A few wanted other professions, such as one boy who wanted to become a county agent, another a veterinarian, and one girl wanted to be a nurse. They all reported that Mr. Ostrowski had encouraged what they had wanted. Nearly none of them had earned the marks equal to mine. It was a surprising thing that I had never thought of it that way before, but I realized that whatever I wasn't, I was smarter than nearly all of those white kids. But apparently I was still not intelligent enough in their eyes to become whatever I wanted to be. It was then that I began to change inside. I drew away from white people. I came to class and I answered when called upon. It became a physical strain simply to sit in Mr. Ostrowski's class.